For over 3,000 years, the Valley of the Kings held its secrets tight. But one tomb, untouched and silent, was waiting to be found. When that moment finally came, the world didn't just gasp at the mountains of gold or the priceless artifacts. It held its breath for the story that was frozen inside. The tomb belonged to a boy king, fragile and young, who had been laid to rest with astonishing care. Every object, every amulet, every single layer of linen was a testament to a deep devotion, a fear of imperfection, and a profound human need to protect. Those who sealed the tomb weren't just burying a pharaoh. They were preserving a life, a memory, and a piece of themselves. What they left behind wasn't just treasure, it was a window into humanity, perfectly preserved through time. For more than 3,000 years, silence reigned. No footsteps echoed, no torchlight flickered against the painted walls. The air itself was trapped, sealed behind stone and sand, holding its breath as centuries rose and collapsed above. Empires fell, religions changed, and languages vanished, but deep beneath Egypt's Valley of the Kings, a single tomb remained untouched, not looted, not broken, not even remembered. It waited patiently, as if history itself had decided to pause right there. And when it was finally opened, the world was not ready for what it found. By the early 20th century, the Valley of the Kings was thought to be exhausted. Archaeologists believed everything of value had been plundered long ago. Royal tombs had been stripped bare, their treasures scattered across museums and private collections. Egypt had become a land of echoes rather than surprises. Even the experts were losing faith that anything truly intact still existed beneath the sand. But the valley was deceptive. Its silence wasn't emptiness, it was concealment. Beneath layers of rubble, debris from ancient floods, and the remnants of workers' huts, a staircase lay hidden. It led downward, step by step, into darkness. No one walking above could have known what waited just a few feet below. For centuries, people passed over that very ground, completely unaware they were standing atop one of history's greatest secrets. The sand didn't just bury the tomb, it protected it. This wasn't meant to be a grand burial. The tomb was small by royal standards, modest in its design, and seemed to have been prepared in a hurry. And that is precisely why it survived. Larger, more obvious tombs were like open invitations to looters, but this one was overlooked, forgotten, and erased by time and chance. Ironically, its insignificance became its salvation. Inside, time didn't flow as it does in our world. Dust didn't drift, air didn't circulate. Objects remained exactly where ancient hands had placed them nearly 33 centuries earlier. Wooden chariots leaned against walls. Sealed jars stood undisturbed. Beds, chairs, weapons, jewelry, all frozen in place, as if waiting for their owner to return at any moment. The tomb wasn't just old, it was suspended in time. When the seal was finally broken, the first glimpse wasn't of gold, but of chaos. Objects were stacked tightly, overlapping, squeezed into the limited space. This wasn't the careful symmetry of a planned eternity. It was hurried, improvised, urgent. Whoever prepared this burial had been racing against time, tradition, and maybe death itself. This alone told a story. The tomb belonged to a king who was never meant to be important, a ruler whose reign was short, whose power was limited, and whose name would have vanished into obscurity if not for what lay beneath the sand. Tutankhamun wasn't buried with the confidence of a conquering pharaoh. He was buried with anxiety, with caution, and with layers upon layers of protection, as if those who sealed the tomb feared something was left unfinished. The air inside the burial chamber had not touched human lungs since the Bronze Age. When it finally escaped, it carried more than just dust, it carried history. The scent of resins, oils, and ancient linen filled the space. The walls glowed faintly with paintings untouched by sunlight, their symbols still holding their original color. The past hadn't faded here. It had waited. What stunned the world wasn't just the wealth, but the intimacy of it all. This wasn't a myth or a legend. This was a life interrupted. Clothes were folded. Personal items were stored away. Objects of daily use were buried alongside sacred ones. This wasn't how gods were buried. This was how a fragile human king was prepared for eternity. Every sealed jar suggested nourishment. Every amulet suggested fear. Every layer of linen suggested care. The tomb wasn't silent, it was speaking, telling a story that was never meant for the modern world. And yet, the world listened. The discovery changed everything. Archaeology was no longer just about fragments and speculation. Here was proof untouched, complete, and brutally honest. It showed how death was handled when it arrived too soon. how rituals bent under pressure, and how belief systems adapted when perfection was impossible. Tutankhamun's tomb didn't survive because it was powerful. It survived because it was overlooked, buried beneath the mistakes of history, assumptions, and miscalculations, and in that burial, it became immortal. This was not just a tomb. It was a moment preserved, a pause in time, a sealed confession of a civilization confronting mortality, fear, and uncertainty. And this was only the beginning, because once the tomb was opened, the real disturbance began, not to the king, but to history itself. How did Tutankhamun's tomb survive for over 3,000 years, perfectly intact, while nearly every other royal burial in Egypt was plundered? The answer isn't just luck. It's a story of geography, timing, and the quiet power of human forgetfulness. The Valley of the Kings was never designed for eternity. It was a secret necropolis, chosen for its isolation, not its strength. Tombs were carved into fragile limestone, hidden away from prying eyes, their locations passed down through memory and ritual. But memories fade, and when they did, the desert claimed these secrets for itself. After Tutankhamun was laid to rest, the valley wasn't a peaceful place. Flash floods were a constant threat, powerful torrents that ripped through the cliffs, carrying sand, stone, and debris down into the low-lying paths. Over time, workers' huts were built for new tomb projects and then abandoned. Later, pharaohs had their tombs carved higher up the cliffs, and the rubble from their construction tumbled down, collapsing the entrances and burying the stairways of older, forgotten burials. In this landscape of constant change, Tutankhamun's tomb lay directly in the path of chaos. The flood debris didn't just pass by, it sealed the entrance shut. The rubble from later constructions completely covered its steps. And on top of it all, the remains of those laborers' shelters formed a new, false ground level. Anyone searching for tombs in the centuries that followed would have walked straight over it, never suspecting that a king's burial lay just a few feet beneath their sandals. The tomb wasn't hidden by some ingenious design. It was hidden by a series of fortunate accidents, and as history often proves, accidents can be the best guardians of all. Tomb robbers were a persistent problem in ancient Egypt. They were professionals who knew what to look for: grand entrances, wide corridors, and deep shafts, the telltale signs of a wealthy, important burial. Tutankhamun's tomb offered none of these clues. Its entrance was modest, its corridor short, its overall footprint surprisingly small. There was simply nothing about it that screamed great pharaoh buried here. Even if thieves suspected something might be below, the sheer effort required to dig through layers of compacted flood debris, all on a hunch, was a risk few were willing to take. Entire dynasties saw their tombs stripped bare within a few generations. Gold was melted down, precious stones pried from their settings, and even the mummified remains of kings were torn apart in the hunt for amulets and jewelry. But Tutankhamun's tomb remained untouched, not because it was fiercely guarded, but because it was utterly forgotten. As time marched on, another layer of protection was added: deliberate erasure. Dynasties rose and fell, religious beliefs shifted, new gods replaced the old ones. It became common practice for new pharaohs to erase the names of their predecessors from monuments, rewriting history to suit their own legacies. Tutankhamun, the boy king from a controversial period, was one of these erased pharaohs. His name was chiseled off temple walls, his memory systematically removed from the official record. And when a tomb loses its name, it loses its identity. It becomes anonymous, a ghost in the valley. This erasure proved to be a powerful shield. By the time foreign powers like the Greeks and Romans arrived in Egypt, the Valley of the Kings was already a graveyard of rumors and picked-over tombs. Treasure hunters searched with a sense of desperation, convinced that all the great discoveries had already been made. The very idea that a complete, unlooted royal tomb could still exist seemed utterly impossible. These assumptions acted like blindfolds. Even the first generation of modern archaeologists made the same mistake. They looked at the valley and saw an exhausted site. They meticulously documented the known tombs, mapped the visible entrances, and concluded there was nothing left to find. Their excavations followed the logic of importance, searching where they expected to find grand tombs, not where history had been careless. And so, the small forgotten tomb continued to wait. Inside, something magical was happening. The sealed chambers, deprived of fresh air, slowed the process of decay almost to a halt. The darkness preserved the vibrant pigments on painted objects. The sacred resins hardened like stone. Linen textiles dried out, but didn't disintegrate. The wood of chariots and furniture cracked with age, but held its magnificent form. The burial chamber had become a time capsule, preserving not just objects, but the very atmosphere of the funeral. This incredible preservation created an illusion of immediacy. When Howard Carter finally peered inside, it didn't feel ancient, it felt paused. It was as if the people who sealed the tomb had just stepped away a moment before. The scene was one of organized chaos. Objects were leaned against walls, stacked precariously, and crowded into every available space, suggesting a burial performed in great haste. And it was. Tutankhamun's death at around age 19 was unexpected. Kings typically spent decades preparing their elaborate final resting places. Tutankhamun had no time. His tomb was almost certainly a repurposed space, perhaps originally intended for a high-ranking noble, not a pharaoh. It was adapted quickly to accommodate a royal burial. This improvisation left clues everywhere. Inscriptions on some items were sloppily overwritten with his name. Other objects clearly bore the names of his relatives, borrowed for his own funeral. But to the priests and workers sealing the tomb, these details didn't matter. What mattered was completing the ritual, ensuring the king's journey to the afterlife was secure. The final doorway was plastered over and stamped with the necropolis seal. The guards walked away, the rituals ended, and the valley began its slow, inevitable process of forgetting. For centuries, scholars debated whether the tomb had been briefly robbed in antiquity. Minor disturbances near the entrance suggest a possible intrusion, but it seems nothing significant was taken. Perhaps the looters were interrupted, or maybe they were frightened away by something they saw. Whatever happened, the seal was quickly restored, and the tomb returned to its deep silence, one of history's rare second chances. The world above changed beyond recognition. Languages died out. Entire cities rose and fell. The Nile flooded and receded, year after year. Great empires fought over the land of Egypt, barely understanding its ancient past. Yet beneath it all, one small burial remained just as it was, holding answers to questions no one even knew they had lost. This is what made the discovery so profound. It wasn't just about the dazzling treasures that were found. It was about what was missing from every other royal tomb ever discovered. Everything. There were no gaps from theft, no centuries of disturbance. This was a snapshot of ancient Egypt as it truly was, not just the broken pieces that survived. The tomb of Tutankhamun didn't survive because it was strong, grand, or well-defended. It survived because it was small, overlooked, and buried beneath a cascade of mistakes, floods, and false assumptions. And in that forgotten darkness, history waited patiently for someone to finally make the right mistake. Can't look where nobody else had thought to look before. By the early 20th century, the Valley of the Kings had become a place of quiet disappointment. Excavations continued, but expectations were low. Archaeology had turned cautious, almost pessimistic. Every season ended the same way, with fragments, broken seals, and empty chambers. The belief that the valley still held untouched royal tombs had become almost embarrassing to defend. Most scholars had already moved on, convinced that the great discoveries belonged to the past. One man refused to accept that conclusion. Howard Carter had spent years walking the valley, memorizing its contours, studying where others had stopped searching. He believed that absence itself was evidence that the missing king must still be there, not hidden by design, but buried beneath neglect. His theory was simple. Tutankhamun was too minor, too forgotten, to have been thoroughly hunted by looters. If the tomb existed, it would be where no one thought to look. Funding this belief was another matter. Excavations were expensive, slow, and humiliating when they failed. Patronage was drying up. Lord Carnarvon, who financed Carter's work, had grown impatient. Seasons passed, with nothing to show for all the effort and expense. The valley seemed stubbornly empty. Eventually, an ultimatum was given one last season. One final chance. After that, the work would end. It was a quiet, desperate agreement. The dig resumed in an area previously dismissed as unimportant. Rubble, debris, and the remains of ancient huts cluttered the ground. Other archaeologists had passed over it countless times. There was no visible entrance, no promising alignment, just disorder left behind by history. Then, the ground changed. A worker's tool struck stone, naturally flat, unnaturally smooth. Carter was called. More debris was removed. A step emerged from the sand, then another, each one descending into darkness. This wasn't a wall. It wasn't a foundation. It was a staircase. Carter knew immediately what this meant. He ordered the steps cleared carefully, painfully, slowly. Each movement carried the weight of years of hope and doubt. If this was a tomb, it was sealed. If it was sealed, it had been protected. The air felt different. The silence grew heavier. When the bottom step was revealed, a plastered doorway appeared, bearing ancient seals. They were intact. This was the moment history shifted. Carter did not open the door immediately. He sent an infamous telegram to Lord Carnarvon. Weeks passed. The door remained sealed, holding back 3,000 years of silence. The restraint was deliberate. Once opened, nothing could be undone. When Carnarvon arrived, they stood together before the door. It bore the stamp of the royal necropolis, not broken, not scratched, untouched. The seal was pierced carefully. A small hole was made. Carter inserted a candle. The air inside did not rush out. It moved slowly, cautiously, as if reluctant to leave. Carter peered inside. At first, he saw nothing but darkness. Then, as his eyes adjusted, shapes began to emerge. Gold glinted faintly. Animal forms, furniture, chaos. Carnarvon asked the question history would remember. "Can you see anything?" "Yes," Carter replied. "Wonderful things." But what he did not say was just as important. What he saw was not order, it was urgency frozen in place. Chariots leaned awkwardly against walls. Beds were stacked. Objects overlapped. This was not a ceremonial display. This was a hurried packing of eternity. The tomb had not been opened, but its closing had clearly been rushed. As more light entered the chamber, details sharpened. The walls were intact. Paintings glowed with their original color. Boxes sealed with cord and clay filled every available space. Weapons rested where hands had last placed them. There was no dust trail, no signs of centuries of disturbance. Time had simply stopped here. The antechamber was catalogued, not entered. Everything was photographed, recorded, and left untouched. The silence was respected. Even so, something had already changed. The moment the seal was broken, the tomb became vulnerable to air, to time, to the modern world. News spread quickly. The discovery electrified the globe. Newspapers erupted with headlines. Photographs circulated. Crowds gathered in the desert. The quiet valley became a stage. Expectations exploded. The tomb was no longer a secret, it was a spectacle. And yet, the most important chamber still lay beyond. The burial chamber remained sealed behind another wall. Painted figures guarded it. Protective deities faced outward. The barrier was intentional. What lay beyond was not meant to be seen by the living. When that wall was finally breached, the reality of what had been preserved became undeniable. A golden shrine filled the room. Then another, and another. Nested layers of protection surrounded a stone sarcophagus. Within it, 3 coffins. Within those, a body wrapped in linen and resin. And within that, a mask of solid gold. This was not excess. It was fear. Each layer existed because someone believed one layer might not be enough. Protection was multiplied, not trusted. The burial was an act of reassurance, not confidence. And in that moment, it became clear that the tomb's survival was not just an archaeological miracle. It was a psychological one. The world had not just found a king. It had found a civilization's deep anxiety, preserved perfectly in gold and stone. Once the tomb was opened, that anxiety would begin to echo far beyond the valley into myth, rumor, fear, and legend. Because history was no longer silent. When the final wall was breached, the air inside the burial chamber felt heavy, as if the space itself resisted intrusion. Their eyes all faced inward, toward the sarcophagus, not outward to greet visitors. This room had been sealed with a clear and powerful intention. Nothing here was ever meant to move again. At the center stood the stone sarcophagus, a massive, immovable object, occupying nearly the entire chamber. It wasn't positioned for display, but for permanence. Around it, golden shrines rose like nested barriers, each one sealed, each one engraved with prayers and protective spells. To reach the king, the living had to pass through layers designed to defeat time itself. The removal of these layers was a slow, methodical process. With every seal that was broken, the environment inside was altered. Air rushed into spaces that had been closed for thousands of years. Ancient resin cracked. Gold shifted slightly, as if adjusting to a world it no longer belonged to. The very moment the tomb was opened, it began to change. Inside the stone sarcophagus lay the first coffin, shaped like a human form. Then came a second, and then a third, each one more elaborate, more stunning than the last. The final coffin was made of solid gold. Its sheer weight alone spoke of fear, devotion, and a desperate desire for absolute finality. No expense had been spared here. This wasn't a show of confidence in eternity, it was an all-out attempt to guarantee it. When that final, golden coffin was opened, the body was revealed, but not in the way anyone expected. The mummy was fused to the coffin by hardened resin. Layers upon layers of linen had been soaked, then baked by time into a single, immovable mass. Any attempt to remove the body intact proved impossible. It became clear that the embalmers had used an excessive amount of resin, perhaps in a panic, or maybe to compensate for something they feared wouldn't hold together on its own. This was not the image of a perfect, godlike pharaoh. As the wrappings were carefully cut away, evidence of profound fragility emerged. The body was small. The bones were delicate. Deformities became apparent. This was not a great warrior king. This was a child, burdened with illness. The physical reality lying beneath the gold shattered the myth of divine perfection. Tutankhamun had lived in pain, and the embalmers had known this. The entire burial reflected it. The numerous walking sticks found throughout the tomb were unjust symbolic items. They were necessary aids for a king who struggled to walk. Beds were specially shaped for support. Protective amulets were layered in excessive numbers, as if reassurance had to be multiplied to be effective. Even the famous golden mask told a story of correction. Its features are idealized, symmetrical, and strong. It doesn't reflect the body that lay beneath it. It replaces weakness with a vision of eternity. This wasn't deception, it was an act of faith. The mask wasn't meant to show who the king was in life. It showed who he needed to become in the afterlife. The more the body was studied, the clearer the urgency of the burial became. Damage to the bones suggested a severe injury shortly before his death. Infection may have followed. His chronic illnesses would have weakened him further. The king died suddenly, without preparation, leaving his caretakers to improvise an eternity in just a matter of days. That improvisation left scars all over the tomb. Some artifacts were clearly repurposed. Names on objects were altered. Items originally made for others were hastily adapted for the young king's burial. The tomb was a patchwork of grand intention and rushed necessity, ritual bent under the pressure of time. The pursuit of perfection was abandoned in favor of simply getting it done. This sudden urgency explained the chaos found in the antechamber. It explained the crowded conditions, the jumble of priceless objects, and it explained the excessive layers of protection. Fear had guided the hands of those who sealed the tomb, not the fear of gods, but the fear of failure. They knew they had one chance, and they could not afford to get it wrong. The body itself became the final, undeniable proof. Modern scientific analysis would later reveal congenital disorders, likely caused by generations of royal inbreeding. Malaria may have weakened him further. From the very beginning, his life had been a fragile one, and yet, in death, he was surrounded by the most extraordinary care imaginable. The tomb revealed not a story of power, but one of compassion, not a tale of triumph, but one of immense effort. It showed what happens when a civilization confronts death without certainty, relying on tradition, belief, and sheer human attention to compensate for life's unpredictability. The burial chamber was not a place of confidence, it was a place of hope. Every single spell, every layer of gold, every protective amulet was a desperate attempt to stabilize what life had made so unstable. The embalmers were not preparing a god for his rightful place in the cosmos, they were protecting a child. This understanding completely transformed the discovery. Tutankhamun was no longer just a symbol of ancient Egypt's wealth and excess. He became a symbol of vulnerability, a boy king elevated, not by his own strength, but by the love and care of those around him. And as his fragile body was slowly revealed, history was forced to confront something it often ignores, that greatness is sometimes preserved, not through power, but through attention. The tomb was no longer just intact, it was intimate. When Howard Carter breached the doors of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, he broke a silence that had lasted for over 3,000 years. But what replaced that silence wasn't celebration, it was anxiety. The world's attention shifted from archaeology to fear. It began with Lord Carnarvon, the man who funded the entire expedition. Months after the tomb was opened, he was bitten by a mosquito in Cairo. The bite became infected, leading to blood poisoning, and he died suddenly. The timing was perfect for a story. Newspapers ran wild with it. They claimed lights flickered out across Cairo at the moment of his death, that his dog back in England howled and died at the very same hour. None of it needed to be true. A narrative had been born. the curse of the pharaohs. The idea was irresistible: a sealed king, ancient warnings, and a modern, unexplained death. The world, it seemed, wanted a punishment for this intrusion. The curse became the perfect explanation for the deep unease people felt. As time went on, more deaths followed. Some were connected to the excavation team, most were not. But it didn't matter. Natural causes, illnesses, accidents all were woven into the growing myth. Every tragedy became proof, regardless of logic. The fact that most of the team lived long, healthy lives was conveniently ignored. Fear loves patterns, not facts. Inside the tomb, nothing had changed. The golden artifacts remained silent. The boy king's body lay still. But outside, the story had taken on a life of its own. The tomb was no longer just a discovery. It was a warning. But what was the real story? The truth was far quieter and far more scientific. The tomb's sealed environment was genuinely dangerous, but not supernaturally so. For millennia, mold spores and ancient bacteria had thrived in the dark, stale air. The excavators worked long, grueling hours under immense stress, heat, and pressure. Infections were likely. Accidents were to be expected. But a logical explanation rarely stands a chance against a terrifying myth. The curse persisted because it spoke to something deep within us. It suggested that the past could fight back, that history has its own boundaries, and that there are consequences for our curiosity. Howard Carter, the man who actually found and entered the tomb, dismissed the curse entirely. He lived for another 17 years, dying of natural causes. But his survival was a boring headline. It didn't sell papers or soothe collective anxiety. The myth of the curse actually reshaped how the world remembered the discovery. It turned a moment of incredible archaeological significance into a spooky legend. It distracted from the real treasure, an almost perfectly preserved record of ancient life, of care, and even of vulnerability. Think about it. The ancient Egyptians layered the tomb with protections, not because they were confident, but because they were afraid of grave robbers and the passage of time. And how did modern society react to uncovering it? With our own form of protection, a story, a myth, a curse. It was a way to create distance from something that felt too intimate, too real. The curse narrative framed Tutankhamun's tomb as a dangerous exception, an anomaly that could be marveled at, but ultimately dismissed. But the tomb wasn't demanding fear. It was demanding attention. The objects inside weren't threatening. They were whispering stories of a young king's life, of illness, and of a rushed, improvised burial. They showed us that history isn't always grand and epic. It's often fragile, messy, and deeply human. The curse simply drowned out those whispers. Slowly, as the painstaking work of cataloguing and preservation continued, the tomb began to reveal its deeper truths not through myth, but through meticulous detail. And with each tiny detail uncovered, the curse began to fade. Not because it was disproven, but because it became unnecessary. The tomb was never angry. It was vulnerable, and that vulnerability, preserved for millennia, then suddenly exposed and profoundly misunderstood, that was the real shock that awaited the world. For decades, the story of Tutankhamun's tomb was one of a curse, a golden king, and unimaginable treasure. But as the fear settled into myth, a different story began to emerge, whispered not by legends, but by the objects themselves. As archaeologists carefully removed, photographed, and catalogued each artifact, they uncovered a portrait not of a mighty pharaoh, but of a life that was carefully and tenderly supported. The tomb didn't scream of dominance. It documented dependence, routine, and a constant effort to adapt. Among the most revealing items were the walking sticks. Over 130 were found scattered throughout the tomb. This was far more than any healthy young ruler would ever need, and they weren't just for show. Many of them showed clear signs of wear, their handles smoothed by the grip of a hand that relied on them day after day. These were not ceremonial symbols of authority. They were practical tools. They were silent witnesses to a king who struggled to move, a young man whose every step was likely accompanied by pain. The tomb was quietly confirming what forensic analysis of his body would later suggest. Tutankhamun was disabled. This theme of support continued with the furniture. The beds and chairs weren't designed for regal posture or to impress visitors. They were built for comfort and stability. Some were reinforced, others were lower to the ground, shaped to accommodate a body that needed rest more than it needed to project power. This wasn't furniture for a grand throne room. It was furniture for a life that required constant care. The artisans who crafted these pieces weren't just serving a king, they were tending to a person. Each object, preserved in the dry air of the tomb, spoke volumes without a single word. Even the chariots told a similar, surprising story. 6 were discovered, and they weren't all the same. Some were lightweight and clearly ceremonial, perhaps used in parades, but others were different. They were sturdier, more functional, designed to be ridden while seated, not standing like a warrior king. Think of them less as ancient war machines and more as the world's first all-terrain mobility scooters. They were adaptations, clever ways to allow a king who could walk far on his own to still move through his world, to participate in hunts and festivals. The variety of chariots suggests a process of trial and error, a constant search for the best way to accommodate his physical limitations. And what about the weapons? A king's tomb should be filled with instruments of power, and it was. Bows, arrows, daggers and swords were all present. But when examined closely, they revealed a secret. They had seen little, if any, real use. They were symbols of kingship, not records of a great warrior. They projected an image of strength and authority, a necessary facade for any pharaoh, even if the body of the king himself couldn't live up to that ideal. The tomb was a stage, and every prop was designed to maintain the illusion of power, even when reality was one of fragility. It was the personal items, however, that added the most human layer to this story. Tucked alongside the sacred religious artifacts were everyday objects, his childhood toys, board games, finely woven clothing, and jewelry. These weren't necessary for passage into the afterlife, according to religious texts. So why were they there? Because they were familiar. They were comforting. The people who buried Tutankhamun weren't just preparing a god for his journey into eternity. They were protecting a young man they had known. They were surrounding him with the things that made him feel safe in life, hoping they would do the same in death. This blend of the sacred and the personal reveals a fascinating shift. The burial wasn't just about following a rigid set of ancient rules. It was about reassurance. It was driven by a human impulse. For those sealing the tomb, ensuring continuity and comfort for their king mattered more than following tradition to the letter. They placed what felt right, not just what was prescribed by the priests. It was an act of care, frozen in time. Even the world-famous golden mask reflects this beautiful, poignant balance. We see its serene expression, its perfect, idealized features. But this wasn't a true portrait of Tutankhamun. We know from his mummy that he had a clubfoot and other physical ailments. The mask wasn't meant to be a realistic depiction. It was a promise. It was a magical act, transforming the physical reality of a life marked by illness into an eternal image of wholeness and perfection. In death, the mask declared, the king would finally become what life had so cruelly denied him. It's not just a masterpiece of art, it's a profound statement of hope. This need for reassurance is hammered home by the amulets. Hundreds of them, literally hundreds, were carefully placed between the layers of the linen wrappings on his mummy. Each one was chosen for a specific protective purpose. Some were there to guard his internal organs. Others were meant to defend against the decay of his flesh. Still others were to ensure his safe passage through the dangerous trials of the underworld. The sheer number of them, this overwhelming abundance, suggests a deep-seated anxiety. One spell wasn't enough. One amulet was not sufficient. Redundancy became a form of reassurance. If one charm failed, surely another would work. Suddenly, the crowded, almost cluttered nature of the tomb started to make perfect sense. This wasn't a display of excessive wealth just for the sake of it. This was insurance. Objects were stacked and crammed into every available space, not because of poor planning, but because fear was abundant. Every single artifact was another prayer, another magical shield, another desperate attempt to stabilize a fate that felt uncertain. The burial wasn't a confident stride into eternity. It was a careful, tiptoed procession, laden with every possible safeguard. Modern science has since confirmed this interpretation. Analysis of the king's remains tells a story of a life compromised from birth. Genetic issues, physical deformities, a weakened immune system, and recurring bouts of malaria plagued him. His reign was short, and his life was fragile. The burial, with its intense focus on protection, healing, and support, was a direct and loving response to the reality of his life. The tomb also held clues about the political realities of the time. When experts looked closely, they found that some items had been recycled. Names of previous owners, like Nefertiti or Akhenaten, were found hastily erased and replaced with Tutankhamun's. This wasn't a sign of disrespect or negligence. It was a sign of urgency. It suggests that the young king's death was sudden, arriving before all the preparations for his eternal home were complete. His burial team had to improvise under immense pressure. They reused what was available, adapting rituals to fit the circumstances. Tradition had to bend without breaking. The result wasn't a picture of flawless royal planning, but a real-time record of survival and ingenuity. And this is what makes Tutankhamun's tomb so revolutionary. It reveals that ancient Egypt wasn't the rigid, monolithic culture we sometimes imagine. It was responsive. It was human. When faced with the fragility of their king, they compensated with overwhelming care. When faced with the uncertainty of death, they adjusted their traditions. This understanding completely changes the narrative. Tutankhamun isn't important because he was a powerful ruler. He wasn't. He's important because his burial remained honest. It wasn't propaganda carved in stone. It was a true story sealed in a tomb. It shows us the deeply human side of a civilization often remembered only for its colossal monuments and distant gods. The tomb of Tutankhamun did not exaggerate his strength. It lovingly documented his weakness and the extraordinary network of care that rose up to meet it. And in that care, in that compassion frozen for 3,000 years, lies the true, enduring power of this incredible discovery. Decades after the last artifact was lifted from his tomb and placed behind museum glass, the story of Tutankhamun was far from over. It was as if the dust, once settled, was stirred again by a new kind of curiosity. New tools emerged, and with them, new questions. What had once been studied with the naked eye was now examined by machines capable of seeing beneath skin, bone, and even myth. For nearly a century, the tomb had held its secrets. Now, the body itself was about to speak. When modern scientists turned their attention to the famous mummy, they did so with immense care. This wasn't about creating another spectacle for headlines. It was about finding clarity. Early X-rays had already hinted at fractures and abnormalities, but the technology of the 21st century was a world away from those initial attempts. A full CT scan was performed, a procedure that created thousands of digital slices, revealing the boy king in unprecedented detail. What appeared on the computer screens surprised even the most seasoned experts. The skeleton was delicate, the bones thin and fragile. His feet showed severe deformities, including a pronounced clubfoot that would have made walking a constant, painful struggle. Suddenly, so much of what was found in his tomb made sense. The hundreds of canes weren't just symbols of authority. They were mobility aids. The furniture, uniquely adapted for someone who needed support while sitting, was no longer a stylistic choice. The chariots, built for stability rather than speed, were clearly designed for a rider who couldn't stand unaided. The old theories of a dramatic end began to crumble. There was no evidence of a massive trauma from a battlefield injury, no fatal blow to the head, no sign of a dramatic assassination. The fractures that had once fueled theories of murder were re-examined. Scientists now believe they were simply post-mortem damage, likely caused during the rushed mummification process or by Howard Carter's team during the initial excavation. The central mystery of Tutankhamun's death shifted away from violence and toward vulnerability. The next step was DNA analysis. Tiny, carefully extracted samples from the mummy began to tell a quiet but deeply unsettling story. Tutankhamun's parents were not just royalty, they were brother and sister. This practice, while shocking to us, was common among ancient Egyptian pharaohs who believed it was necessary to preserve their divine bloodline. But biology doesn't care about belief, it simply records the consequences. The genetic results were stark. They revealed a host of inherited conditions, including multiple bone disorders and a severely compromised immune system. Tutankhamun's body was built under immense strain from the very beginning, but the most significant discovery was yet to come. Deep within the king's tissue, scientists found clear traces of Plasmodium falciparum, the parasite that causes the most severe form of malaria. This wasn't speculation. It was measurable, scientific evidence. For a young man with an already weakened body and a fragile immune system, a severe bout of malaria could easily have been fatal. The picture was now complete. The boy king hadn't been cut down by his enemies in a palace conspiracy. He had been undone by his own genetics and the unforgiving hand of nature. This complete reframing of his life changed everything. His short reign was no longer a story of failure, but a testament to incredible endurance. He didn't rule because he was strong. He ruled because he managed to survive long enough to do so. With this new understanding, the contents of the tomb aligned perfectly with the science. The sheer abundance of protective amulets, the vast quantities of medical herbs, the healing symbols carefully placed among his linen wrappings, these were not just symbolic gestures for the afterlife. They were a continuation of the intensive medical care he would have received in life. They were desperate attempts to defend a body that everyone knew was fragile. The ancient embalmers, even without microscopes, had seen the signs of his illness. They understood his frailty and prepared his burial accordingly. The discovery of specific medicinal plants among the burial goods added even more weight to this idea. Ingredients known to ease pain, reduce inflammation, or fight infection were found right alongside purely ritual items. In ancient Egypt, the line between medicine and magic was always blurred. A healing poultice was just as important as a magical incantation. Tutankhamun's burial wasn't a single act, it was the final act in a lifetime of care. In light of these discoveries, the sensational stories of a pharaoh's curse that once dominated the headlines started to feel hollow and cheap. The mysterious deaths linked to the tomb's opening could now be explained through much more mundane causes. Coincidence, the stress of the excavation, and exposure to dormant bacteria or fungi inside the sealed tomb. The real danger had never been supernatural, it had always been biological. The myth of a cursed, all-powerful king faded away. In its place, a far more compelling human story emerged, a child born into immense power, but burdened by a painful genetic inheritance. Even the timing of his sudden death at age 19 gained a new, tragic clarity. A weakened immune system, a severe leg fracture that likely became infected, and a raging case of malaria circulating through his blood. It was the perfect storm. No grand conspiracy was needed. His body simply gave out. This new understanding doesn't diminish the wonder of the discovery. If anything, it deepens it. Tutankhamun became relatable in a way no other pharaoh had been before. He was no longer a distant, golden god-king. He was a human being, shaped and limited by circumstances entirely beyond his control. His tomb wasn't just a treasure chest. It was a time capsule that preserved that fragile humanity. It showed us that ancient Egypt wasn't just a land of pyramids and gold, but also a place of caregiving, adaptation, and quiet, determined resilience. The boy king was protected as much as possible in life, and in death, that protection continued in the form of his magnificent tomb. And yet, even with these answers, new questions arise. Why was such a fragile child placed on the throne of the most powerful empire on earth? What immense political pressures shaped his rule while he struggled simply to stand? What powerful forces were moving in the shadows around him? To understand that, we have to step back again, not into the tomb, but into the treacherous world of the royal palace. To truly understand Tutankhamun, we have to look beyond the glittering gold of his tomb and step into the chaotic world he inherited. Imagine this. You're just 9 years old, and you've been handed the keys to an empire in turmoil. This was Tutankhamun's reality. He became king right after the tumultuous reign of Akhenaten, a time when centuries of religious tradition had been thrown out the window. The old gods were gone, replaced by a single sun god, Aten, and the entire religious and political structure was a mess. This young boy was dropped right into the middle of it all. A tangled web of power struggles and high expectations that most adults would find impossible to handle. Of course, a 9-year-old doesn't rule an empire alone. Tutankhamun was surrounded by powerful advisors and regents who made the real decisions. Men like Ai and Horemheb, two seasoned officials with their own ambitions, were the ones shaping policy, planning military campaigns, and guiding the massive project of restoring the old religion. Every decree the boy king signed, every monument built in his name, was really the work of these powerful adults. They knew Tutankhamun was physically frail, and they built the entire court around his limitations. Thrones were specially reinforced, ceremonial processions were kept short, and practical supports were woven into the fabric of royal ritual. Even his tomb gives us clues about this reality, a life carefully supported by others, a scaffold that extended all the way into the afterlife. The art from his reign tells a fascinating story. If you look at the statues and inscriptions, you'll see an idealized Tutankhamun, tall, strong, and perfectly symmetrical. These images weren't meant to be lies. They were aspirations. They were a form of public relations, communicating to the people and the world a vision of strength that the boy king could unphysically project himself. Behind this golden mask of power, his reign was fragile and incredibly dependent on the people around him. His tomb perfectly captures this duality. On one hand, you have the magnificent artifacts celebrating divine kingship. On the other, you have the everyday items, the numerous walking sticks, the reinforced beds, and other personal supports that tell the story of his reality. Even military and state ceremonies were adapted to his physical condition. Evidence suggests that he never personally led troops on long, grueling campaigns. Instead, his generals and officials would carry out military plans in his name, maintaining the illusion of a powerful warrior king in command. His life, much like his tomb, was meticulously arranged to preserve his dignity despite his vulnerability. Every single object, every careful arrangement in his burial chamber, reflects a society that understood fragility and knew how to adapt to it. This wasn't about hiding a weakness. It was about managing it with respect and ingenuity. Religion was at the very heart of his reign. Tutankhamun is famous for one major policy shift, bringing back the old gods. After the radical changes of Akhenaten's time, his rule marked a return to traditional worship. This meant restoring temples that had fallen into disrepair and reinstating the powerful priesthoods of gods like Amun-Ra. This was a monumental undertaking that required incredible coordination, political skill, and physical endurance, things a young, frail king likely didn't possess on his own. Again, his advisors were key. The tomb itself is a testament to these religious efforts, filled to the brim with amulets, sacred symbols, and ritual objects designed to protect him. This idea of protection, both spiritual and physical, was a constant theme in his life, and it was meant to continue long after his death. The political world he lived in wasn't just complex, it was dangerous. With a child on the throne, courtiers and advisors were constantly jockeying for influence and power. The instability from the previous reign still lingered in the air. Tutankhamun's sudden death at a young age would have thrown this delicate balance of power into chaos. This sense of urgency might explain why his burial seems both hurried and yet so incredibly meticulous. There was a desperate need to ensure the young king's body, and by extension his royal authority, was properly preserved, without any mistakes. In this sense, the tomb wasn't just a grave, it was an extension of the palace, a final act of political stagecraft, designed to maintain order even in the face of death. But the artifacts also reveal a more personal side to his story, showing the care that surrounded him. We find jewelry, games, and small personal trinkets that suggest affection and attentiveness from the people closest to him. His daily life, though constrained by his health issues, was clearly filled with thoughtful items designed for his comfort and well-being. Each of these objects served a dual purpose. They were both practical and symbolic, helping to bridge the vast gap between the vulnerable child and the divine god-king he was meant to be. This blend of the personal and the political is what makes his story so compelling. Even the world-famous golden funerary mask illustrates this tension. Its flawless symmetry, its divine expression, and its sheer weight are all meant to project eternal, unshakable kingship. But we know that underneath it lay a body that was fragile and all too human. His tomb doesn't try to erase this vulnerability. In a way, it honors it. It shows us a society that was capable of managing uncertainty, protecting its most vulnerable members, and ensuring continuity despite the imperfections of reality. Political survival, religious restoration, and the projection of power all came together during Tutankhamun's reign, and every single artifact in his tomb is evidence of these competing priorities. Ultimately, his burial wasn't just about death. It was a powerful statement about his life. The tomb preserved the boy king not just as he was, but as history needed to remember him, a carefully constructed symbol of authority, who was, at the same time, intimately human. When you look at it this way, the tomb becomes more than just a treasure chest. It's a detailed narrative of adaptation. The concepts of fragility, care, and protection are encoded in every layer of linen wrapped around his body, every amulet placed for his journey, and every object packed into those crowded, perfect chambers. The ancient Egyptians understood that life was uncertain. Their response wasn't denial. It was strategy, ritual, and incredible devotion. Now, with modern science, archaeology, and a bit of imagination, we can see this story clearly. The fragile boy, the political machine around him, and the religious world they inhabited were all deeply intertwined. Death was inevitable, but the way they responded to it revealed their intelligence, their empathy, and their deep desire for continuity. For millennia, Tutankhamun's tomb was a silent witness to these human qualities. Once feared as the source of a curse, it now reveals the true complexity of life in ancient Egypt, the fragility of kings, the ingenuity of their people, and the incredible persistence of care across time. When the world first laid eyes on Tutankhamun's tomb, it wasn't just a discovery, it was a seismic shift in our understanding of history. Suddenly, this boy king, once a minor footnote, was a global sensation. But the world wasn't just mesmerized by the gold. It was captivated by the story those treasures told. A story of a life cut short, of a civilization's profound care, and of a fragility once hidden, now laid bare for all to see. The tomb became both a spectacle and a lesson. The glittering gold mask, the nested shrines, the jewel-encrusted objects, they fueled our imagination. Yet, the real magic lay deeper. It was in the human details. People saw that Tutankhamun was small, frail, and unwell. Yet he was surrounded by extraordinary attention and effort, even in death. His tomb wasn't just a monument to power. It was a testament to protection, love, and meticulous care. Exhibitions around the world amplified this fascination, drawing millions. Crowds weren't just coming to see ancient gold. They were coming to feel a connection to the past. The tiny shoes, the walking sticks, the games, these personal items told stories more compelling than any textbook. They allowed us to step into the world of a boy who lived over 3,000 years ago and understand his vulnerability. For scholars, the tomb was a scientific goldmine. Archaeologists, chemists, and medical experts descended, using modern tools to uncover what ancient hands had tried to protect. They learned about his health conditions, his injuries, and the clever adaptations made for him. Where once we saw only a symbol of royal power, we now saw a human being, a case study in resilience and adaptation. This discovery also reshaped our ideas about legacy. Tutankhamun's reign was short, his life fragile. Yet, because of the incredible effort invested in his burial, he is remembered far more than many mighty pharaohs. The sands of Egypt, which had hidden him for centuries, had preserved a powerful lesson. Legacy isn't just about conquest, it's about care, preservation, and human attention. Of course, the discovery sparked a cultural phenomenon. Movies, books, and art drew inspiration from the tomb. Wild stories about a pharaoh's curse added a layer of drama, fueling the public's obsession. But beneath all the sensationalism, a quieter truth emerged. The tomb offered a profound insight into how we, as humans, grapple with mortality and express devotion. We weren't just fascinated by ancient Egypt. We were fascinated by a story that reflected our own humanity. We saw ourselves in their efforts to protect the vulnerable. Modern science continues to pull back the curtain. DNA analysis and CT scans have confirmed the boy king's frail health and physical challenges, but they also revealed the genius of the tomb itself. The sealed air, the arid climate, the layers of debris all converged to create a perfect time capsule, protecting even delicate textiles and pigments. Every object tells a story of intention. The chariots were designed for a king who couldn't stand unaided. The famous walking sticks weren't just for show. They were used. The gold wasn't just wealth. It was a form of ritualized security. This wasn't a story of excess, but of purpose. In the end, what the world found in Tutankhamun's tomb wasn't just treasure. It was a mirror. It reflected our own deepest instincts, our fear of loss, our devotion to those we care for, and our enduring desire for permanence. The story of this fragile boy king, elevated by the love and intelligence of his civilization, reminds us that history isn't just written by the powerful. It's also written by the careful, the devoted, and the loving. And that is a story that will continue to fascinate us forever. Over the decades, the story of Tutankhamun kept changing, not because of new treasures, but because the tomb itself began to speak across the millennia. Every golden layer, every protective amulet, every object placed with such precision was a testament to care, attention, and incredible human ingenuity. The boy king's life was brief, fragile, and filled with uncertainty. Yet, the world came to understand that his death was far from the end of his influence. Through careful preservation, incredible patience, and a bit of luck, he had become eternal. The impact of this discovery stretched far beyond Egypt's borders. It completely reshaped archaeology, introducing new, meticulous standards for documentation and conservation. Scholars finally realized that an intact burial offered so much more than just wealth. It provided a complete story and narrative of life, belief, and the structure of an entire society. Tutankhamun's tomb, frozen perfectly in time, became a priceless teaching tool. It revealed not only the practices of ancient Egypt, but also universal truths about mortality, adaptation, and the profound nature of human care. When visitors flocked to exhibitions, they marveled at the golden mask, of course, But it was the smaller, more intimate objects that truly captured their hearts. Tiny, worn sandals, delicate jewelry, personal utensils, and even children's toys. These items told a story far richer than gold alone could ever express. They revealed a deep vulnerability, a life of adaptation, and the thoughtful attention of those who cared for the young king. The tomb's intimacy made Tutankhamun relatable. He was no longer a distant, godlike figure. He was a child whose health, life, and death had been carefully managed and deeply mourned. As science evolved, it began to pull back even more layers of the story. Modern CT scans, DNA studies, and advanced chemical tests confirmed he had congenital disorders, suffered from malaria, and lived with significant physical fragility. Each new discovery reinforced the same powerful message: Tutankhamun's life was incredibly precarious, and yet, those around him acted with extraordinary diligence to protect him. The tomb, so carefully arranged and flawlessly preserved, was a perfect mirror of the care he had received in life. It wasn't just a grave. It was a historical document of both vulnerability and devotion. With this growing understanding, the sensational myth of the pharaoh's curse began to fade. The deaths once linked to the tomb were re-examined and seen for what they likely were: coincidence, stress-related illness, or simply natural causes. The world's fear transformed into a fascination grounded in human reality. The true awe wasn't in some imagined supernatural retribution, but in the incredible ability of a civilization to manage fragility and mortality through ritual, master craftsmanship, and meticulous planning. Tutankhamun's tomb also ignited the public imagination in a new way. Artists, writers, and filmmakers drew inspiration from his story. The boy king became a symbol, not of conquest or power, but of humanity preserved. He was a powerful reminder that our fragility, our vulnerability, and our mortality can be managed, understood, and even honored. Museums around the world began to display his artifacts, not just as treasures, but as stories of endurance, care, and the continuity of history itself. This global fascination reinforced a central truth: history isn't just about power, it's also about empathy, intelligence, and attention to detail. Even the tomb's physical survival is a story of ingenuity. Its endurance through centuries of flash floods, erosion, and human activity was a lesson in environmental contingency. The dry desert climate, the sealed chambers, and the layers of debris that buried the entrance all acted as natural protectors. The tomb itself showed how chance and deliberate design can combine to preserve memory for millennia. Humanity, both ancient and modern, was witnessing a rare and perfect alignment of effort and good fortune. Through all of this, Tutankhamun's life and burial taught a lesson that extends far beyond Egyptology. It showed us that greatness isn't always measured by military conquest or political influence. Here was a boy king whose true impact came not from his power, but from his survival, the care he received, and the careful attention of those around him. The tomb preserved this message perfectly. Its intact state offered a direct, unbroken line back to a deeply human experience of vulnerability and ingenuity. As time moves on, the tomb remains a reminder that history is not a static thing. It is constantly shaped by accident, by effort, by care, and by our own interpretation. Tutankhamun's burial teaches us that the act of preservation is as much an act of empathy as it is an act of ritual. The world at the time was waiting for treasure, drama, or a dark myth. Instead, what it received was understanding, intimacy, and profound truth. So the story doesn't conclude with spectacle, but with quiet reflection. Tutankhamun's tomb was a warning, a lesson, and a marvel, all at once. It showed how fragile a life can be, how powerful human care is, and how even the smallest details, a set of walking sticks, a child's toy, a simple amulet, can speak clearly across thousands of years. An ancient civilization had attempted to protect a fragile child, and the modern world responded with awe. And now, when we look upon these artifacts, when we read the inscriptions, or study the scientific data from his remains, the message is crystal clear. Tutankhamun did not survive through strength alone. He survived through adaptation, through careful attention, through devotion, and through the extraordinary human effort of those who surrounded him. His tomb, preserved against all odds for thousands of years, became a mirror for all of humanity, reflecting our own vulnerability, our ingenuity, and our timeless fundamental desire to care for one another. 3,000 years had passed. Generations of scholars, explorers, and curious minds had searched the Valley of the Kings. Most of the tombs they found were gone, plundered, destroyed, lost to time. But this one remained. It wasn't just a monument to a boy king. It was a monument to preservation itself, a monument to attention, a monument to humanity. Tutankhamun had waited silently beneath the sand, and when he was finally found, he did not merely reveal a trove of treasures, he revealed what it truly means to live, to care, and to endure. The world had anticipated gold, but it found history. The world had expected a myth, but it discovered humanity. And in that deep silence, beneath the Egyptian desert, the boy king's story continues to speak. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more journeys into the past. See you next time.